So, the most important element in a story is conflict. If there is no conflict, there is no story. Let me say this again. If there is no conflict, there is no story.
Hello and welcome. I'm Sanjay Khandelwal, and this is The Break School, a self learning podcast to enable you to do what you love every day. The purpose of this episode is to learn to use authentic stories to improve the quality of our lives and businesses. Now, you may ask, what on earth is authentic stories? Is that a new buzzword? Well, fair enough. I had a similar reaction. That's why on the show today, I have a person who will separate the buzz, who will separate the cliches, who will separate the noise from the word stories and storytelling and help us understand what makes stories authentic, how stories shape our lives, and how can you and I leverage the power of stories to improve the quality of our lives and businesses. The guest on the show today is Ameen Haque. Ameen is a storytelling coach and founder of Storywallahs, an organization that helps businesses and startups leverage the power of stories and storytelling. Before starting Storywallah, Ameen served as a senior vice president at world-leading advertising firm Ogilvy and Mather. Ameen's curiosity about stories got him hooked very early on to books, theaters, and of course, to the world of advertising. If you're curious, I assure you, Ameen will get you hooked to the art of weaving beautiful stories. And yes, if you have stories that you'd like to share with the world through this beautiful medium of podcasting, then I'm launching an 8 weeks long podcast coaching program starting 9th of May to help you do just that. You can write to me at sanjay@thebreakschool, THEBREAKSCHOOL.com for more details. Now, enjoy the conversation. Presenting Ameen Haque. Hi, Ameen. Welcome to the Break School. How are you doing?
Very good and good to be speaking with you, Sanjay.
Thanks a lot for coming down, Ameen. We are in, I think, 6th or 7th day of the national lockdown, which is going to be 21 days long. How have you been making use of this time?
Well, I've been enjoying it actually. I like the pause that the lockdown has put on our life. It
Uh-huh.
allows me time to look back, reflect. I've been reading, listening to a lot of music, playing some music, and catching up on some stories and movies that I've been wanting to watch for a long time. So I'm grateful. Also, it's required. At one level, you can say that we have no option
Correct.
but to live with this. Uh, at another level, I would say it's too good to be wasted.
Yes. What kind of stories or movies are you watching right now?
I've just started reading Mahabharata.
Okay,
Movies,
lovely.
there's a long playlist.
Mm-hmm.
There are some movies that I watch with kids that we've lined up. So I
Okay.
saw Hugo, which is a wonderful movie, which is about a child who has to live on a railway station and live his entire life on a railway station.
Okay.
So how does he live his life?
Right.
Uh, Another movie that I saw with kids was Castaway, something that
Mm-hmm.
I had seen many years ago, but I wanted to see it with them, particularly during the lockdown, because it's interesting how less you need to get by in life. And here we are sitting complaining about all the things that we don't have access to. You just have to go back and see that movie to see how less we need to get by in life.
Can you repeat the name of the second movie that you just mentioned?
Castaway, Tom Hanks.
Castaway. Okay, I haven't seen it.
No, you haven't seen Castaway? It's a
No.
brilliant performance. He gets stranded and he lives on an island for 4 years before he is rescued.
Oh.
We've spoken about these things in games that we play in hostel on late nights. That who would you want to be stranded with at an island, or if you were stranded on an island dash dash dash, what would you do? Now here's an entire movie about a guy who's the only person on an island and he's there for 4 years, and
Right.
how less we need to get by.
Right. I would love to be stranded with Deepika Padukone. I wish. But speaking of Tom Hanks and speaking of Hugo, like you said, right? I remember watching one of Tom Hanks' movie. I don't remember the name, but this guy lands in New York and he's not allowed to get out of the airport. So he stays in the airport for, I don't know, for a few weeks or months for whatever reason, and the entire movie is about a stay at the airport. And similarly, like you said, at Hugo, it's about this guy who has to spend his entire life on a railway station. Now these are very small incidents, but when such small incidents are shown for 3 hours, how do you think the person who's writing these stories would be thinking of showing this simple incidents for 3 hours? How would they be focusing on details, or what would be their approach?
Yeah, that's a great movie, the one that you referred to. It's called The Terminal.
Yes.
And Tom Hanks is always getting stranded somewhere or the other. Many of his movies are like that.
Yes. Yes.
But Castaway is different. It's just one actor throughout the film. It's
Right.
very much like Trapped. So you've got one actor throughout the movie. There's no other supporting actor. Trapped is also interesting because the physical space is very, very narrow.
Right.
Therefore, you have to go deeper into the person's thoughts. The narrative plot is not about the outside, then.
Mm-hmm.
The narrative plot is about the struggle inside and what keeps you going.
Hmm.
And if you see Castaway also, when the place becomes narrow, you have to expand the scope of the story. When the physical space becomes narrow, the
Mm-hmm.
only way to expand the scope of the story is to go into the mental dimensions of the character and see where that expansion is possible.
Right, right, right. But you just mentioned a word which I often get confused by: narratives. What is a narrative, and I mean, and how does it relate to, let's say, a story or storytelling?
I use the words interchangeably, honestly, and I don't worry too much about semantics. So I don't restrict the usage of the word storyteller to the one who narrates a story in the oral tradition.
Right.
I also use the word storyteller to include those who sing bhajans and
Mm-hmm.
kirtans, actors on stage. Chetan Bhagat, Narendra Modi is also in some ways a storyteller.
Right.
So, coming back to your question about narrative, the yarn that the storyteller is spinning is the narrative.
Okay.
The yarn could be the religious one if the storyteller is a preacher.
Mm-hmm.
The yarn could be a political narrative if the storyteller is a politician. The yarn could be about a brand if the storyteller is an advertiser or the brand manager.
Right.
All of these are narratives of different kinds.
Hmm.
And we are constantly consuming various kinds of narratives as consumers. We consume narratives in the newspaper when we open the newspaper. 70% of the news covered in all newspapers is the same, but the way the editorials are written depends on the political slant of the newspaper.
Right.
We watch sports on television, but we also consume that sport through the lens of the sutradhar, and the sutradhar is the commentator.
Right.
Therefore, when the Sutradhar is Akash Chopra versus when the Sutradhar is Sanjay Manjrekar, we have a different view on what's playing out on the field versus when it is Harsha Bogle. These are all forms of narrative.
Right, right. So, are you trying to say, let's say, I have something called facts, and then the way I present this facts and the message I try to communicate through these facts is what the narrative is, and I can communicate different messages with different in different ways using the same facts, and those are different narratives.
So, at some level, I would agree with you, but it's not just presenting of the facts that becomes a narrative. There's something more than that. Uh, Let me present three or four statements of facts to you that are not a story. Let's say the character here in the situation that I'm going to share with you is Radha,
Okay.
and Radha is a secretary who has joined an organization. It's her first day of work,
Okay.
and she's a business secretary to a very senior person. Radha comes into office, uh, logs on to the computer,
Mm-hmm.
then goes to her boss's cabin, takes a dictation,
Mm-hmm.
comes back and keys that in, writes that memo, prints it,
Mm-hmm.
has lunch during the lunch break,
Mm-hmm.
uh, goes to the restroom, comes back, types out a few more memos, sends them out, and then goes back home.
Okay.
There are lots of facts here, but it's not a narrative
Yeah. Right.
because there's nothing that draws the listener. There's nothing that's happening here that says what next.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing that's happening here that offers me any surprise. But let me now offer you an alternate to
Hmm.
the situation that I described just now. Radha comes into the office. It's her first day at work. She goes to the boss's cabin, who gives her a dictation. She goes to her computer and starts keying it out. At the same time, a chat window opens up on her computer. It's her boyfriend who has called to wish her on her first day at work, and he's so happy to see her. While she's been away at work, he has got a tattoo done on his ass, and he wants to show her that tattoo. So he unzips and he's about to show her that tattoo when her boss just happens to stop by at her desk. Now you want to know what happened next.
Right. Yes. 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 The element of
That's what
surprise.
narratives, yeah, the element
Mm.
of surprise, the element of, wanting, the curiosity,
Correct.
wanting to know what happens now.
Mm. Hmm. Hmm. Interesting.
That's what's called conflict in the classical sense, right? If there is a conflict, there's a character, there's some conflict, then we want to see how what resolution will take place in the story.
Right, right. And I'm really tempted now that you've started talking on it, right, as to what makes a story. And one of the element that you mentioned is this, for example, the element of surprise or making people curious out here. And just going in depth there. But before that, fundamentally, what according to you is a story?
It's a deep question that you have asked. At the simplest level, the answers are very simple. That story is nothing but character, conflict, and resolution. There
Right.
are characters in story, they face some conflict, and how they resolve that conflict. That's what essentially makes up a story.
Mm-hmm.
See, storytelling has become a big buzzword today. It's the
Yes.
latest buzzword in town. The word is formed by union of two words, story and telling.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of attention today is paid to telling, how to tell a story well.
Right.
But let's focus back on the first word. What is story? And increasingly, you would have also heard these days a lot of people talk about the need for authentic stories, that a story needs to be authentic. So, what makes a story authentic? Let's deep dive a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
To me, there are two or three things that make a story authentic. Number one is your actions.
Okay.
It's not what you say, but what you do that matters the most. Indeed, your actions speak louder than words, because story is not just for telling, story is for living.
Okay.
Let me give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
When Starbucks closed down 8,000 outlets for racial bias training,
Mm-hmm.
it said a lot more about their desire to learn how to be an inclusive organization than any public relations note the company could have issued.
Right.
So, the questions that leaders need to ask themselves is whether the actions of the organization are they aligned to their core beliefs and core values. Leaders lead with actions. Now, let's look at an Indian example. When N.R. Narayana Murthy, who was heading Indian IT company called Infosys,
Mm-hmm.
when he wanted to send a message out to his employees about being cost conscious, what did he do? He started flying economy class himself. Now, that's the story that goes viral. And that one action speaks louder than any form of messaging ever can.
Right.
Gandhi understood very well that there is no story that travels faster than one which is manifested in the actions of the leader. His adoption of charkha, when he adopted the charkha, the Dandi march, his fasting, these were all actions that amplified the messages he wanted to convey.
Mm-hmm.
But he lived the story.
Right. Yes.
So, story is for living. And when I say story is for living, you live and die by that story. The greatest stories that have ever been told are the religious stories.
Mm-hmm.
And at some level, they are very beautiful stories, but these are also the biggest weapons of mass destruction that the world has seen.
Correct.
More people have died in the world fighting for and defending the stories that they believe in.
Correct.
So, in that sense, what is story? Story is not something to tell. It is first something to live by. when you narrate a story that is aligned with what you do, and when your actions are aligned with your belief systems,
Mm-hmm.
then your story is authentic.
Right. Right.
The second pillar that makes a good story a story is story worthiness.
Okay.
And what makes a story worthy is if it answers fundamental conflicts that we face in human life.
Okay.
The reason I use the word fundamental is that they are almost like evergreen.
Right.
These conflicts have been there 200 years ago, and these conflicts will be there even after 100 years.
Right. And the universal.
They're universal, they are timeless, they are about love, they are about jealousy, they are about money, they are about life, they are about death, and what happens to us after we die.
Right.
These are these are things that make a story worthy. And therefore, to me, a good test of story worthiness
Mm-hmm.
is when your story is told by others.
Right.
Now, Sachin Tendulkar doesn't go and tell his story everywhere, but his story is told by many people.
Right.
That's a story worthy story because that's a story of dedication, of submitting oneself completely and wholeheartedly to one simple act and spending 26 years of your life on those 22 yards and saying, this is going to be my life in the quest for perfection.
Right.
And that's what makes something worthy of being told. And
Right.
the best test of that is when somebody else tells that story.
Right. Right. When it is used to perhaps help another person engage with the situation in their life, maybe.
Yeah. So that's what stories do. They resolve conflicts in our life.
Right. Wonderful. I mean, I've heard a lot of definition. I've heard stories are sequence of events which lead to a certain point. I've heard stories are narratives. I've heard stories are combinations of characters and the conflicts. But your answer, in a lot of ways, summarizes why stories have been so important, because it helps us deal with situations that all of us at some point go through, and perhaps help us make sense of the situations through these stories. But I just want to ask you one thing, with the advent of all the apps and everything, we see the term story being used pretty much everywhere. Facebook has this section called stories, so does Instagram. As you said, it's a buzzword, it's used everywhere. How do you look at this? Is it making it more accessible, or is it just reducing its meaning?
Uh, Both at some level.
Mm-hmm.
Words, when they get overused at some level, lose their power.
Right,
In economics, there is this concept of diminishing returns,
right, right,
that,
right.
which is essentially a curve which shows that with overuse of something, there's a flattening of the curve that happens, and
Correct.
beyond that, the value that you get out of that keeps reducing
Mm-hmm.
over time.
Mm-hmm.
So word it also happens to words, and words with overuse lose their impact.
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
simplest way to explain that to me would sorry the simplest way that I can use to explain that is to use a swear word, with the best possible intentions here, but and I'm assuming that your audience, if they are all above grade 8,
Mostly,
would
yeah.
would uh, would have come across this word much earlier than much earlier than this podcast.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
you know I grew up in a small town,
Huh?
and I went to Kendriya Vidyalaya school. My mother tongue was Hindi. We spoke Hindi at home,
Mm-hmm.
and we were not my exposure to English cuss words was late. So I
Right.
was in seventh or eighth class when I first heard the word fuck.
Okay.
And I still remember it had such an electrifying effect on me
Mm-hmm.
that for 2 days I almost walked in a daze, in a state of shock. And with this awe, with this feeling of awe and respect towards the person who said that. But with overuse
Hmm.
of that word in everyday life,
Hmm.
the word has completely lost its power to shock us.
Right.
So, coming back to answer your question about the overuse of the word storytelling, and Facebook using the word stories, and at some level it is welcome because it brings stories back into the limelight.
Correct.
And I sometimes sit back and wonder, what makes us human is the fact that we tell stories.
Hmm.
Then what has caused the storytelling to come back? And what has made it a buzzword, like you said, that everybody is using the word stories? What has caused that? Where has that come from? So, my answer to that perhaps is this, that when something gets overused,
Hmm.
then we need a counter to that.
Right.
To give you an example from music, starting 1980s, the use of computer programming, the use of computers, recording equipments, the use of artificial sounds, loops, hyperloops, etc. All of this became very common in music.
Right.
Riffs. Some of the best musicians today use a lot of technology to make music,
Right.
whether it is A.R. Rahman or whether it is Amit Trivedi. Now, when the use of technology increases, the counter trend to that is we crave for the simple experience of music, which is raw and unplugged
Correct.
music. Similarly, the industrial era, computers, PowerPoint, the mechanization of narratives and presentation through PowerPoint,
Hmm.
it had become such a big trend that we craved for normal conversations and narratives, and we started telling people, keep the PowerPoint aside, tell me the story. Can you please whiteboard it? Don't show me PPT, just tell me the story. So just like the counter trend in music, similarly, there is this need for simpler narratives and stories. And that's what has brought stories back into consciousness.
Yes. You touched upon a lot of points that I could very well relate to. I mean, one, of course, is I listen to a lot of unplugged music, especially while I'm working. But the second part, which you mentioned about the human species having this unique ability to tell stories, it just reminds me about this really nice book that I read, a thought-provoking book, I would say. Nice would be a very understatement. Uh,
Sapiens by
Sapiens
Yuval
by
Noah
Yuval Noah
Harari.
Harari. Yes, yes,
Yes.
yes. When he talks about the sapiens having this ability to tell stories that could enable coordination with more than 50, 100, and thousands people, and how India as a nation, for example, is a story. Because otherwise, I or somebody else sitting in, let's say, Northeast, or somebody else sitting in Rajasthan may not have anything in common, but we have a common story that we tell ourselves, that we belong to this common nation with common culture and all of that. And that is why we believe that we are one in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. He talks about that. He talks about that. He talks about how nations are stories. He talks about how money is a story, that we have bought into that story, that this piece of paper, which has 2000 written over it, we actually believe that its value is 2000. There's another piece of paper which has got 50 written on it, and we believe that its value is 50. It's a
Right.
story that we have collectively created and bought into.
Right.
And we are the only species who has that ability
Correct.
to create, communicate, and at a mass level, believe in these kind of stories.
Right, right. And this is the crucial word, like you said, believing it at a mass level, because 1.3 billion people believe that this white note will fetch me something, or will is worth 10 rupees. It is worth 10 rupees. But if people stop believing there, or if people stop believing in nationhood, then everything goes for a toss. And that's where I think our idea of narratives come in, that everybody believes in this one narrative, or because there are diverse narratives, there are diverse points of view.
Yeah, so these are again, answers that we have created. Going back to the definition of story, a lot of other things are elements of stories. They're not definitions, but what are, by definition, stories an answer. So, what is our answer to trade, and what allows us to trade? What is the common currency that we can create for trade? So it's
Right,
a that so we've created a story for that, and that's the story of currency and money. What binds us together?
right.
We look we we you know somebody comes from China and I come from India, somebody comes from Middle East, from Australia. What binds us together? So then we have these belief systems. So Christianity binds us together, Islam binds us together, Hinduism binds us together. So we have created these narratives that many people can believe.
Correct, correct, correct. And now that we've looked at what stories are, which are answers to certain common problems or conflicts that we face normally in life, I would just like you to go a little bit into the elements of story. Like, you've already spoken a bit on this, which is about the elements of surprise, there being a conflict. But can we go a little in depth as to what are the different elements of a good story, be it a business story or a general story or religious story?
To start with, the simplest elements are character, conflict, and resolution.
Right.
At the heart of it is conflict.
Okay.
So, the most important element in a story is conflict. If there is no conflict, there is no story.
Right.
Let me say this again. If there is no conflict, there is no story.
I agree.
If Ravana had not kidnapped Sita, there would be no Ramayana. If
Hmm.
Kauravas had given away the land which belonged to the Pandavas, we would not have had Mahabharata.
Hmm.
Take any story in the world. Boy sees girl, girl sees boy, both fall in love and live happily ever after. You have never read a story like this ever before. Nobody has read a story like that
Right.
because there is no such story. But boy meets girl, girl meets boy,
Mm-hmm.
and father says, "Nahi, ye shadi nahi ho sakti." Now we have a story.
Yes.
So, the most important element in any story is conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what separates a good story from a not so great story is,
Mm-hmm.
if a story resolves a conflict that is present in the hearts and minds of many people at that point of time, then that story becomes great at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some that resolve fundamental, deeper conflicts that are more timeless in nature. Those stories become evergreen stories. So,
Hmm.
let me explain this concept of time. Some conflicts also exist in time
Mm-hmm.
and they reduce over a period of time. So, then the
Right.
stories that address those conflicts, the importance of the stories also reduces over a period of time.
Correct.
For example, if you look at Bollywood, you know, the conflict of roti kapda makan were big conflicts for us in the 1960s, in the 1950s, in the even up to the 1970s. So you had a lot of stories to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
These are called existential, on the Maslow's hierarchy, the more
Yeah.
fundamental concerns
Correct.
that people have. But Dil Chahta Hai doesn't talk about that.
Hmm.
The Zindagi Milegi Na Dobara doesn't talk about that conflict. And these are very important films of our time.
Correct.
The conflicts that we have now are not of roti, kapda, and makan, but they are more first world conflicts for certain parts of India. The first world conflicts, I use that within quotes, first world conflicts, is they're more existential in nature.
Right.
That, what is the purpose of my life? What is the meaning of true happiness? And
Right.
we are trying to find answers to these questions now because पेट में खाना है,
Hmm.
सर पे मकान है,
Hmm.
लेकिन दिल में कुछ खालीपन है.
Arre, re, re. That
So
was a
इस
shairi.
खालीपन को इस खालीपन को कैसे भरें? Now, when that becomes the conflict,
Hmm.
you need a story that answers that conflict.
Yes.
So that's what I meant by some stories answer conflicts in the present time.
Right.
But if you look at religion as a story, that story has existed for many years, depending on which religion we are talking about. Some are more older than that.
Yes.
They are more timeless in nature because they are about death and what happens after death. Where do we go? Where have we come from? So
Hmm.
they are more timeless.
Right. But how do you take this element, let's say, into business storytelling? So there are two questions that I have here. One is you said stories resolve conflict. What kind of conflicts exist in businesses that the story is trying to resolve?
Well, let's replace the word conflict with a simpler word.
Okay.
Problem. Is that a fair word to use for conflict?
Yes, I think
Problem.
we can. Yeah. Yeah.
And what is business? Or what does an entrepreneur do? If story is character, conflict, resolution,
Okay.
which is problem resolution of a certain kind, business is also that. An entrepreneur looks at a customer problem
Mm-hmm.
and says, can I resolve this problem for the customer in a way that is win win for both? Where the problem gets resolved for the customer
Mm-hmm.
and I get some value in return for resolving that problem. And if you can resolve that problem profitably, you are in business.
Right. So I understand your point about businesses resolving conflict and their living or their existence is a story, a solution to those conflicts. But where do businesses use storytelling, or why do they need to use storytelling? Where are they going wrong that storytelling can help correct the path or help correct a mistake?
So, good question. That's really a fantastic question. And one part, we've already addressed, which is that the business's actions speak louder than their words.
Correct.
So Starbucks can say I am inclusive, but if I don't take coffee from somebody who wears a hijab, for example, and I say I refuse to take coffee or to be served by you,
Mm-hmm.
then as a customer I am not being inclusive. And if they pander to that customer and say, okay, yes, somebody else, then they are not living their values.
Correct.
But what they can also do is they can amplify this message, because this incident may have happened at one place. But if they can tell the story of what happened at that store to all the stores,
Mm-hmm.
now, if the story goes viral within the internal system, that's a way of explaining the company values far better than through some PowerPoint presentation.
Right. Right.
All companies during induction have presentations that tell people who join the company what are our values, what are our culture. You ask people 5 days later, they'd have completely forgotten. Yeah. But if you
Yeah.
had instead for every value, if there was a corresponding story, people would remember.
Right.
So stories make it easy to remember. And that's why in internal communications, coming back to business, if I want my employees to behave in a certain way, I can have memos, I can have guidelines, and I can have manuals, or I can tell them story.
Correct.
Number two, you also need stories for external communication, because we live in an attention deficit world. We live in a world which is cluttered with so much information that where is the time for messaging to go in to my mind?
Mm-hmm.
So you must have heard of this phrase, "Jungle mein mor nacha kisne dekha."
No, not no, 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 no. What does it mean?
Simple muhavra, what it means is that the peacock danced in the forest, but who was there in the forest to see it?
Right.
Now, many companies are doing great work like this, but who is there to see who has the time to come to you, to your factory,
Mm-hmm.
and to come to your software lab and see the great work that you're doing? So, you need to communicate that message to the customer.
Right.
The problem is you are not the only one going to the customer. Your competitors are also going to the customer. So, your message is one amongst many.
Right.
That's why if your message is not a story, first of all, it is not going to stand out. Second, it will not be remembered. And what gets remembered is what gets acted upon.
Correct.
So that's why companies are moving towards a more refined, more well informed adoption of storytelling in both internal communications and external communications.
Right. Wonderful. Wonderful. And this brings me the second part of your answer about using stories to communicate your work or the value of your products and the conflicts that it will try to resolve in customers' life and how it could make things better for them. Let's say I am a freelancer, I'm a podcaster, or I'm a YouTuber, or I'm a writer, and there are a lot of freelancers. Okay, and I need to offer my services to a few clients, and I'm a completely newbie. I'm just entering the market, and I'm trying to find new clients. What questions should I ask myself to build a good story that would communicate my value? What questions should anybody ask themselves to write a good story about their work?
So think hard about your skill.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're a YouTuber or a podcaster or you're a content writer or a musician, a gig economy worker, a designer who can design posters and social media communication for someone. If you're a filmmaker, there's not one filmmaker. There are documentary filmmakers. There are filmmakers who work in the cinema industry. There are filmmakers who make explainer videos for startups, and there are still other kinds of filmmakers who will make your marriage video.
Mm-hmm.
So what you have to ask is, what conflict can my skill resolve? What conflict for my customers, for my potential customers, can my skill set resolve in the best possible way?
Right.
That's the question that we need to answer and say, do I have a skill that resolves a conflict in someone's life?
Mm-hmm.
If it does, then how do I tell the story of that in a way that communicates my value proposition? Now, value proposition is about how is it differentiated from others who are offering the same,
Mm-hmm.
and how is it valuable to somebody else. So, if I'm a filmmaker, the story that you need to tell is through the films that you have made. So, do you have a portfolio through which I can tell, through which I can see how you solve my need for a movie if I'm your customer? Or can you do a scratch film? You may not never done it for you may not have been commissioned by it.
Mm-hmm.
Can you make a scratch explainer video by yourself? Show me some of those, and then I'll be happy to engage with you.
Yes. Yes. At one of the talk that you gave at Google, one of the things that you mentioned, and I found it very profound, is the problem of lack of vocabulary. Now, even when I have to, let's say, communicate my value proposition to someone, my biggest problem I think here would be is to have a rich set of words that I can use to clearly communicate my message. In fact, very recently I was working on this exercise wherein I had to identify three or four traits of few characters in a movie, and the only words that I had in my mind was confident, brave, inspirational. I was honestly struggling to identify words that could actually explain the difference between those characters or explain the subtleties of those characters. How have you seen this serve as a problem, as you had mentioned in the talk, in businesses wherein daily used vocabulary is actually making the message weaker?
Well, it goes back to the same problem that we spoke of diminishing returns, right? You use the same words again and again, they have lesser and lesser power, which is why you need newer words. And vocabulary is not just of words, but it's also visuals, it's also of
Correct.
soundscapes. A.R. Rahman talks about it. He says, when I was called in to compose background music, he just doesn't do music for songs, but he also composes the background music, which is important in movies. Any scene has background music,
Hmm.
which captures the emotion of that scene. And he says, if I can already see that it's a sad scene, why must my music be equally sad?
Okay.
I can see that it is sad scene. So when I layer the same kind of music, I'm not adding anything new.
Okay.
Through the soundscape, can I add something new? So I can see sadness, that there is death on the scene.
Hmm.
But in that sadness, is there hope? Is there dignity in death? So can my music play, can dial up dignity in death a little bit?
Okay.
Is there defiance in death? Sorry, if you see Bhagat Singh, for example, Shahid Bhagat Singh, you
Yes.
know,
Yes.
what he shouted just before he was hanged, there was defiance.
Hmm.
So he says, if I'm showing that scene, there is sadness there. Somebody is dying. In the 1960s, 70s, 80s, you would play typically there'll be violin that will come out.
Correct.
And in the violin, there'll be a sad tune. He says, can I add defiance to that?
Hmm.
So now he's bringing vocabulary in soundscape,
Right. Right.
a richer vocabulary that adds something and that adds layers to the story. You can bring it through visuals and we can bring it through words.
Mm-hmm.
So, depending on medium we are working in, we must look at developing our vocabulary and also seeing, are we bringing newness in, and are we communicating in words that are not so overused that the impact of a message is completely lost.
Right. But speaking of verbal communication specifically, how does one enrich their vocabulary? Is it just buying a word power made easy text, or there is something more to the experience of learning and enriching your vocabulary to tell better stories?
Well, you will see that good storytellers have good vocabularies. In history, you would see that. Speaking of just verbal vocabulary here, the great spiritual leaders, be it Swami Vivekananda, or political leaders, take Gandhi or Nehru or Great business leaders, whether it is Steve Jobs or Jack Welch or Richard Branson, all of them have great vocabulary.
Right. But what does the process of building vocabulary look like? Yeah.
Yeah, how to build vocabulary is through reading, through exposure to people, through medium, to messages that have better, richer vocabulary,
Hmm.
not through dictionary. Language is not learned through dictionary. If you look at it, it may sound counterintuitive, but just think about it. A 2-year-old is able to express complex emotions, and a 2-year-old has never referred to a dictionary.
Mm-hmm.
Language is learned through listening, through exposure. So we need to expose ourselves to better stuff.
Quality stuff.
Yeah, and Sanjay, if you think about it, if you come across a difficult word, even today,
Mm-hmm.
in our conversation, if you come across a difficult word,
Mm-hmm.
you will not open a dictionary. You will think about the four words that preceded the difficult word and the four words that succeeded the difficult word, and
Yeah.
using the context, you will say approximately that must be the meaning of that word.
Absolutely.
That's how we make sense, through contextual approximation. That's
Correct.
how kids learn. That's how language is learned. So, language is learned through listening and exposure, and vocabularies are built in the same way.
Right. I totally agree with that. And the reason I agree is because I've generally learned by observing, not just vocabulary, but actions, a bit what works in public speaking. But talking of vocabulary specifically, as you mentioned, when you hear someone say a certain word and when you start to make sense of it contextually, you also remember it well. Perhaps maybe to use it sometime next.
Absolutely, and this is true of all kinds of, speaking of profession, take a photographer, for example. The best way to build your vocabulary in photography is to study the work of great masters.
Right.
So look up the work of great masters, and see the way they used to compose, see the way they played with light, with shadow, see the way they played with depth of field. You know, I learned I learned photography, and initially when you learn photography, you buy a camera and you want to go out of the house and say, if you have a bike or if you have a car, you say,
Mm-hmm.
where can I go for a trip this weekend? Because I am going on a photography expedition. But if you look up the works of the greatest photographers, some of the biggest photographers in the world have not traveled too far.
Right.
They captured their surroundings, but they saw what everyone saw, but they saw it through a lens that was different, and they allowed us to see everyday life around us through a different lens. Now, the word I have used here is lens,
Mm-hmm.
is nothing but vocabulary, visual vocabulary, that a photographer would use to show us a leaf in a way we had never seen a leaf,
Mm-hmm.
to show us garbage in a way that we had never seen a garbage pile.
True.
That's what photographers do. So if you are a photographer listening to this podcast, if you are a YouTuber listening to this podcast, if you are a cinematographer or a videographer listening to this podcast and saying, how do I get into my profession?
Mm-hmm.
Look at the work of the masters in that profession, and
Mm-hmm.
and expand your vocabulary in your sphere.
Right, right. And I really love how you've compared words to lenses, and it makes so much sense. Which is to say that using words, you show people what you see, perhaps that might have not been seen by anybody else around you. Uh, are there any specific people or speakers or leaders that you look up to, or at least you enjoy listening to, and who you think have really rich set of vocabulary and who really know how to use language well?
So many of them that it would be difficult to name.
Let's focus on business leaders for now. People who can really communicate business messages well. Steve Jobs is my favorite. I mean, I don't know if that was on the list.
Up there on my list as well. There,
Hmm.
I am a big fan of Indra Nooyi. Her ability to capture something really well, her use of humor, authenticity, it comes across so really well. I love the way Sheryl Sandberg communicates her messages.
Hmm.
Jack Welch, Richard Branson, all of these are wonderful communicators. In closer home, I find Nandan Nilankani to be hugely underrated. His ability to communicate even data and weave that into narrative is outstanding. There are quite a few business writers. There's Prakash Iyer, who used to work at Pepsi and Unilever at some
Okay.
point of time, and he's an author. He's written a couple of books like The Habit of Winning, The Secret of Leadership.
Hmm.
There is Sudhir Sitapati, who's written a book called The CEO Factory. My ex-boss, Santosh Desai, who writes a weekly column in Times of India called City City Bang Bang. I have always admired his ability to use a turn of phrase in a particular situation. His metaphors and analogies are brilliant, to say the least. So these are just some of the people that I look up to and admire. It's a long list. I can just go on and on.
That's definitely quite long. But what we'll certainly do is all the names that you've mentioned, and among all of these guys, anybody who writes consistently, who has a blog, or we'll figure out what platform do they write on, and we'll share a link in the show notes section of the episode. But you brought up something, I mean, in what you just mentioned here about Nandan Nilekani and his ability to weave narratives with numbers. This is one of the common problems that all of us face, be it as freelancers or be it as individuals working in organizations. What do you think is wrong with the communications that we do with numbers, and what are better strategies or approaches that could be used to communicate information with numbers in a much easier and memorable manner?
It's the subject of a different podcast by itself because it's a vast topic.
Right.
But let me give you, two examples from two different techniques that can be used in working with number-based narratives. One is articulation, the other is visualization.
Mm-hmm.
Now, visualization actually, on second thoughts, let me not go into it because there is enough that has been said. There are brilliant TED talks on data visualizations. There's some
Mm-hmm.
wonderful work being done on websites like infogram.com or information is beautiful. Just look up a website called information is beautiful,
Okay.
and you will see beautiful visualizations of all kinds of data. So
Mm-hmm.
the second one is on articulation. How it's not story is not just what we say, but also how we say something.
Right.
So let me give you a numbers based example. Suppose I want to further the cause of diversity and inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And within that sphere, I want to bring to know something about sexual harassment.
Right.
Suppose the data is that 30% of women face sexual harassment. I want to really bring this data out in a powerful way so that it impacts people and it impacts the way we behave after that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what is the best way in which I should communicate this? I'm giving you three articulation choices. Why don't you tell me which one should I use?
Okay.
Here are the three articulation choices. Number one, 30% of women in India face sexual harassment.
Mm-hmm.
Option number two, 3 out of 10 women in India face sexual harassment. Option number three, 1 out of every 3 women in India faces sexual harassment. Which one would you
Mm.
choose?
I would go with third one because it's very narrow and specific.
Now, you made the right choice. 1 out of 3 hits home
Right. It's very personal.
much better than 30%.
Hmm.
And given that I wanted to make an impact, now technically all three are the same.
Mm-hmm.
So I come back to what I said earlier. It's not just what we say, but
Hmm.
also how we say something that makes a lot of difference, and that applies to numbers as well.
Right. Right. And I mean, just going back to talk yours at Google. Another important point that you'd mentioned is a common mistake that many of us commit, which is having a call for action. I find this to be very counterintuitive because I've always believed that I must end anything that I write. There needs to be a call for action to communicate to the person I'm telling the story to do something. Why do you think that is actually causing more damage than doing good?
No, that was said. It's a good question. That was said in a particular context
Mm-hmm.
where I played a video before that, just before saying that. And the video that I had played was a video that I called the Power of Words video. It's there on YouTube,
Right.
where there's a blind beggar sitting on a street and asking for money. And the message that he had written is, I am blind, please help.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody comes and replaces that message with another set of words. Now the words read, it's a beautiful day, but I cannot see it.
Right.
and he ends up making more money with the second message rather than the first one.
Mm-hmm.
If you go back to that video, the words please help on the first message are a call for action.
Okay. Yes.
The first set of words, I am blind,
Mm-hmm.
is the message, I am blind, and then he calls for action, please help.
Mm-hmm.
But in the second message, it's a beautiful day, but I can't see it. There is no call for action
Yes. And yet there is action.
at an apparent level. Yet there is action because you have touched a deeper chord, which is emotion.
Mm-hmm.
When you go deeper and touch that deeper chord, you don't have to spell out the action that somebody has to take.
Right.
When I was learning the ropes in advertising,
Mm-hmm.
I remember reading a line in a book, and it said, when laying a mouse trap, right? You lay a mouse trap for a mouse. Don't put so much cheese inside the mouse trap
Mm-hmm.
that there is no room for the mouse to come in. And what that means is that when we spell out the complete story,
Mm-hmm.
there is nothing for the reader of the story to complete.
Right.
So there must be something left for the reader's imagination, for the viewer's imagination.
Mm-hmm.
So let me give you an example. I'm going to tell you a story, and I will not complete it in the interest of time.
Mm-hmm.
But let me say that, once upon a time, a long, long time ago, at the end of the village, there was a small hut, and in that hut lived a father, a mother, and their kids, a boy and a girl.
Hmm.
The boy was named Rahul, and the girl was called Savita.
Right.
Now, Rahul was very thin as a child, and his mother really cared for Rahul. She wanted him to be healthy, and she used to feed Rahul like all the mothers. She would give him a glass of milk every morning and say, "Drink this milk; it will make you healthy. It has calcium. It will be good for your bones. Have palak. Palak is good for your eyes. Have okra. Okra is good for your brain. Your numerical ability will increase if you eat okra, and have green leafy vegetables." But like any kid, Rahul hated vegetables. Rahul hated milk. But his mother would keep forcing him to have all of this every day, despite his nose and despite. Now, one day, as his mother was force feeding him, he got so upset and so angry that he threw the plate on the floor in anger, and he looked at her, hurt, with tears rolling down his cheeks, and he said, "Nobody loves me in this house. You don't even understand me. I am running away. I am going away, never to come back." And he ran towards the forest.
Okay.
Now, he had been told, don't go into that forest alone. There are animals in this forest. But today he was so upset and he was so angry that he remembered none of that. He
Mm-hmm.
just ran towards the forest with tears running down his cheeks.
Mm-hmm.
Now he kept running into the forest. After a while, he paused and stopped. And when he looked around, he saw that he was deep in the forest. It was a dense jungle.
Mm-hmm.
The trees were so tall that even during the day, when it was daytime, it was dark inside the forest.
Right.
As he walked further, he walked on dried leaves. He could see the leaves. He could hear the leaves cracking. Now he heard the sounds of animals, and some of those sounds were not very friendly. He stopped, he paused. He felt eyes on him, as if animals were looking at him, but he could not see an animal. I'll just pause here. Now, I told you this story. How old was Rahul for you in the story, Sanjay?
I think he was around 12, 13.
And what was he wearing?
Uh, I could imagine in him in a knicker and a shirt, half shirt, in fact.
Could you see the forest?
Yeah, yeah, I can see the forest. I could see the forest, yes.
And you could see some birds and animals as well.
Yeah, even the cracking of the leaves and the twig, dry leaves.
That one at least I described.
Yeah.
But I never described the clothes that he was wearing, and
Hmm.
I never described any bird or any animal.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
you could see all of them. And the interesting thing is, when I tell the story to a large group and ask the same question that I asked you, how old was the boy? For you, he may be 12 or 13. For somebody else, he may be 9. For somebody else, he may be 7 years old.
Right.
You see, when the storyteller tells the story, he's not the only one who's doing the work. The
Hmm.
audience is also actively involved in completing the story in their own mind.
Right.
And when you put the call for action, you leave the audience out of the story. So it's not a diktat against call for action.
Mm-hmm.
I would hesitate to mandate anything, but it's a diktat against lazy call for action. A lazy call for action excludes the audience from the story.
Okay.
A good story should help the audience imagine what they should do and compel them to do it.
Right. Own a part of the story.
Yeah.
Makes complete sense. Although it's a very simple phrase that you've used, but this is something I'm going to make a note of again. Lazy call for action. But thank you so much, Ameen. Thank you so much. I'm really glad came down, and I'm grateful for you having shared all of these experiences. Right, there were some really fundamental learnings from this long conversation that I've had with you today. And one biggest takeaway is stories are to be lived and not just to be told. And if you live good stories, these stories will be told later by others to resolve conflicts. Thank you so much, Amin. How can anyone get in touch with you if they would like to know more about you, more about your work with you, or just get in touch with you?
Hello at storywallahs.com. HELLO at STORYWALLAHS.com. Just drop me an email at hello at storywallahs.com. I usually respond to all my emails within 48 hours and I respond myself.
Right, right. I can vouch for that. By the way, I did receive a response very quickly. Uh, but yes, thank you so much, Amin. Thank you so much for coming down on the show.
And thank you for the gift of conversation and wonderful questions. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Thank you for taking me on a journey of reflection on
Mhm.
storytelling. Thanks, Sanjay.
Thank you, Amin. Thank you so much. So that was Ameen Haque. My three big takeaways from this conversation were: number one, if there is no conflict, there is no story. Isn't this beautiful? Just think, if you've always had a comfortable life, if you've always tried to play safe and be where you are, then do you really have a story worth sharing? On the other hand, if you've been bombarded with difficulties, if you've taken up a project that sent jitters down your spine and challenged your gut, if you pushed yourself beyond the cushions of your comfort, then perhaps things are quite difficult right now for you. But remember, while you go through it, you are weaving a beautiful story that you will be proud to share. When there is conflict, you'll have a story. Lesson number two: great stories help us deal with fundamental human conflicts. As Amin mentioned, the primary purpose of stories is to help deal with the conflict. There are good movies that deal with conflicts of present times, and then there are religious stories from the lives of Krishna, Buddha, Muhammad, or Mahavira that help us deal with conflicts that have existed for thousands of years and are here to stay. Now, extend this to business storytelling. While pitching to your client, do you just focus on your skills or services, or do you also focus on the conflicts of your clients and tell a story? Tell a story that explains how your skills or services helps resolve those conflicts in the lives of your customers. Lesson number three: let the audience own a part of your story. I'm going to repeat a quote that Amin mentioned in the conversation. When you're laying a mousetrap, don't place so much cheese that there is no place for the mouse to come. This is a message I'm going to reflect upon in the next few days. I'd like to understand, how can I weave a call for action within a story without explicitly giving out a call for action. I hope you learned something about stories and storytelling from this conversation. If you have stories that you'd like to share with the world through this beautiful medium of podcasting, then I'm launching an 8 weeks long podcast coaching program starting 9th of May to help you do just that. You can write to me at sanjay@thebreakschool.com for more details. I'll see you next week with more stories and lessons to help you do what you love. Until then, keep doing what you love.